My name is Catriona Laing and I'm the Associate Chaplain at Holy Trinity with a responsibility for social justice projects. And as I was listening to Hector Patmore's mini lecture in this series last week, it set me thinking about injustice and the occasions on which it's carried out in the name of religion, where violence is perpetrated on the religious other. We heard from Hector about the injustice carried out in Palestine and Israel. We know about the violence that has been inflicted by Hindus on Muslims in India. And we know that injustice committed by Muslims towards Christians in sub-Saharan Africa continues to grow. Injustice so often begins with ignorance, or worse, a sense of thinking that you know what the other thinks and believes because of what you've read or been taught. It's possible to acquire a whole lot of knowledge about the religious other without ever sitting down and talking to them. We become self-professed experts, armchair theologians. It can feel like an approach to the religious other that is very much in our heads and from our books, rather than developed from the heart. In this short lecture, I'd like to introduce you to a missionary who has particularly inspired my interest in justice work in interreligious relations. She's interesting precisely because she caught a wave of change at the turn of the 20th century in Protestant missionary ideas. And she developed these in highly creative ways that I think can continue to inform the way in which we seek to understand the religious beliefs and practices of others. Constance Padwick was born in 1886. She was known as Paddy, and she was brought up in the household of one of the founders of the Church Missionary Society. And so naturally, she found herself drawn to Christian missionary work. Following a visit to the Holy Land as a teenager, Padwick soon discovered a personal affection for the peoples and culture of the Middle East, and she determined to serve God as a missionary to the Muslim Middle East when she was older. Padwick's interest in returning to the Middle East developed around the time that missiologists, those concerned with the study and practice of mission, were finding themselves influenced by the study of anthropology. Following the famous World Missionary Conference in Edinburgh in 1910, missionary theology began to take on an anthropological flavour, and missionaries developed an evangelistic approach that prioritised studying the other religion as a means of getting to know and understand the heathen. Other religions came to be seen as systems of belief that were partially true and that could prepare the way for the gospel. As one famous Anglican missionary, Temple Gardner, put it in his report of the Edinburgh Conference, there is a general consensus that representing as they do so many attempted solutions of life's problem, the non-Christian religions must be approached with very real sympathy and respect, that they must be studied, if only to bring the evangelist into touch with the minds of his hearers. And it was with this sort of approach in mind that Padwick took a scholarship from the School of Oriental Studies, now known as SOAS in London. But Padwick felt strongly that the way to study the other was to spend time in their presence. And so she went to Egypt, where she spent 9 months living amongst the village folk of Upper Egypt. Just let me pause there for a moment for you to consider what a gutsy thing it was for this woman to choose to go as a young, unmarried woman in the early 1900s, all by herself, to live in the heart of rural Egypt among the peasant class. And Padwick did this because she wanted, as she put it, to understand the beating heart of the people's religious lives. She said she wanted to understand the religious life of ordinary folk. And the thesis that she wrote at the end of her time on the folklore of Egypt's rural population is testimony to the fact that that is exactly what she did. And this experience, this time in Egypt, influenced the rest of Padwick's career, as well as her own spiritual development. In the first instance, it inspired her to begin collecting Muslim prayer books, not the canonical prayers of official religion, but rather devotional prayer manuals that faithful Muslims would carry in their pockets and take out at different times of the day with which to pray. These prayer manuals formed and shaped the missiological approach that Padwick then developed. So she began collecting copies of these manuals from all over the Muslim world. People would send them from far and wide as word got out that she was collecting these prayer books. And then, with the assistance of bookkeepers and gatekeepers at the entrances to mosques, she would sit and read and study the prayers together with them. In an account of her travels, she recalled a particular moment on one of these forays, this time in the souk in Damascus. She wrote, "I grew insistent that there must be some books concerned with higher things. And under pressure and secretly, another little pile was revealed to me. A Syrian friend barricaded it with his body from public view, while I, the infidel woman, turned over the pages of a specially blessed book. It was a prayer manual compiled by a sheikh who died some 300 years ago and was buried at Mecca. It was a book of those devotions wherein lies the religious strength of Islam." Padwick continued, "Just such a book as Berber doorkeepers of Cairo croon over to themselves on the benches before their Lord's gates. It meets the human need for something more warm and personal than the official worship of Islam." This was how Padwick learned about Islam. And this led her to write an introduction to Islam based on the devotional prayers of the religion. The study of prayer in the company of those for whom these prayers were so important was the way in which Padwick learnt more about the religious other. There is much more to say about the contribution that she made to the Western missionary endeavour, but for our purposes now, I want to highlight one aspect of the change in Padwick that her time living amongst ordinary Muslims initiated. Padwick found herself moving away from an approach guided by Christian apologetics, which insisted on knockdown arguments to disprove the religion of the other. Instead, she was drawn to Christian witness that she described as Theology of Presence, whereby she called for the establishment of praying orders in the Muslim world, where Christians would help to fill the atmosphere, if you like, fill it with the presence of God through their prayers and through their being. In time, conversations may occur, friendships may start up, and opportunities would arise in which to discuss and share the precious truths of the respective faiths. And I like to think that Padwick continues to influence our understanding of what it means to engage well with the religious other in a just way. One way in which her work has inspired my approach to interreligious engagement is through a practice called scriptural reasoning, which began about 30 years ago, initially at the American Academy of Religion. It continues to be the most inspiring and exhilarating form of interfaith engagement that I've had the privilege of participating in. Scriptural reasoning is a practice whereby Muslims, Christians, and Jews gather to study and discuss their sacred scriptures. We choose a theme. This week, we chose justice. And each of us bring a text from our scriptures which speaks to us on that theme. And then together we grapple with our scriptures. We allow the texts to inspire our questions and our conversation. We look at the way in which the texts speak to each other. What questions raised in one might be answered in another. There's no complicated agenda or purpose to our study. It's simply about doing much of what Padwick was doing, getting a glimpse of the beating heart of each other's religion. What does it achieve? On one level, very little. Just like Padwick's living and breathing Egyptian folklore achieved very little. In scriptural reasoning, we say that we privilege friendship over consensus. We're not trying to come up with a neat set of statements that we all agree or disagree about. If anything, it's an exercise inspired by the Jewish tradition of Hevrita study, learning to disagree well. On another level, it achieves a lot. We say that we're not doing it for the sake of any stated purpose. We say that we're doing it for God's sake. For me, reading and studying my Christian scriptures in the presence of my Jewish and Muslim sisters and brothers takes me deeper into my own Christian tradition. I leave a session eager to go back to the New Testament passage we had explored and look at it more deeply. I see that text through new eyes, fresh and unfamiliar again, as new insights come to mind and God reveals God's self in new ways. As injustices committed in the name of religion consume so many parts of our world, I find myself hoping that more people of religious faith would be inspired to get out of their armchairs and find ways of being present with and among people of different religious traditions. Not because this will necessarily help us come up with a new charter condemning injustice, but because we do it for God's sake, whose kingdom of peace and justice we pray will reign on earth as well as in heaven.